Hello and welcome to episode 8 of For What It's Worth, the podcast where I talk to people with interesting hobbies, opinions, and takes on anything and everything. Today, my good friend Murray Van Wyck, someone I met in university, a Canadian by birth, a European by choice, an expat. Murray decided to move and to live in Europe many years ago now, and I wanted to chat with him and see what that journey was like, what his thoughts on it were, advice, opinions on the difference between Europeans and North Americans, on the differences in culture, approaches to life, all sorts of things. I think it's a really interesting view on things. Myself and others I've spoken to often consider this, moving to another country. What's that like? We'll find out. Thanks for listening. Remember, check out FWIWpodcast.net. You can subscribe to our RSS feed there. We're on Facebook and Twitter at FWIW Podcast in both of those places. You can also find us anywhere you listen to your podcasts like iTunes, Stitcher, etc. Look for us, subscribe, and don't forget to share.
It's the hardest part, waiting for that love to come. It's a scary start, when you know there's nowhere left to run.
So, here we are, about to find out why Murray hates Canada.
I hope that's not one of the actual questions.
Well, listen, I mean, some of us want to know that you were born and raised in what many of us and others consider to be one of the greatest countries in the world, and you fled. There are people breaking down the doors to try to get in here.
Well, yeah, that describes a lot of places.
This is true, especially in the West.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what? Like for the benefit of the listeners, you and I have known each other since university, and you were born in Barrie, Ontario, and
No, Thunder Bay.
Oh, sorry, my bad. That's right.
The delightful city of Thunder Bay.
And you quickly escaped that too.
To a much tinier place called Gogama, which is 1 hour between Timmins it's 1 hour to Timmins, and there's only one road going through town, and if you drive the other way, it's an hour to Sudbury. So it's really in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, Gogama, delightful town. Pretty much, my understanding is it pretty much exists for logging reasons. And we were there for a couple of years. Then we went up to Moosonee, which you may know if you ever watched the show Ice Road Truckers. It started out, I think, as a trading post because it's right at the bottom of James Bay. And then it became a NORAD base to, watch for Russian bombers. And then now there wasn't much going on until they discovered like diamonds and that more north of there. And then the show Ice Road Truckers came because every winter when the lake freezes over, the truckers drive out to the diamond mines, and that's how they get resupplied.
And that's why is that the only time of the year they can actually go?
Yeah, either that or they fly everything in, which obviously can get quite expensive. I knew someone who did some of the construction out there, and they said they looked at building a road from Moosonee to these diamond mines, and it would have cost something like $2 or $3 billion. So they decided against it. Yeah, that's not too surprising. I think you can get a lot of planes for $2 or $3 billion, or at least a lot of cargo moved in a plane.
And so was it Barrie after that, or was there still other places?
No, after that it was Barrie. And so, and then it was Barrie for the next 17, 18 years. And that's pretty much it. Until
you made the decision to move to Europe. Wasn't that temporary at first?
It definitely was. So originally I knew some people who went to South Korea to teach English, and I thought that sounded fun, and I wanted to, but I didn't really want to go to South Korea. I was more interested in Europe. And then, as luck would have it, I happened to go to a party where I ran into an old friend from high school who was teaching English in the Czech Republic, and he he basically just come back for like a week or two, and he said I had a chat with him, and he said, "Yo, you should come out to the Czech Republic and visit with me and see if you like it." And I said, "Okay." And then basically I went home and I looked at plane tickets. And I talked to him the next day and confirmed. And actually, I managed to get another friend as well to go, just like on that first trip. But yeah, I went to the Czech Republic for about a week. I thought this was pretty fun. And then he helped me get a job. So after university, I went down and taught English. I went over there for about 10 months and taught English and quite liked it.
So this is happening, you're checking this out as you're finishing up your university.
Yeah. So I kind of knew I wanted to try and do something after university, not just go straight into a job. It was my preferred thing to go to Europe, and probably if it didn't work out, I probably would have just gotten a job in Canada. But I got quite lucky because actually just as a regular kind of Canadian citizen, it is relatively tough to get a visa. To come and work in Europe for more than like a year. Usually you can get like work travel visas, which they expire, in a year. And then you have, what was I going to say? You really can't get them after, I think it's 30 as well. You have to be under 30. But that would have been an option.
So you're doing this through a university?
Oh, no. Oh, well, I ended up teaching for university, although that was just kind of a surprise. Excuse me. Because a friend of mine, he was working in a private school, and it's actually much more likely that you get work in a private school, and the pay is also tends to be better in the private school, but in the Czech Republic, the pay is not great to begin with, so I pretty much went over there for like the kind of the excitement of it.
I see. It was more of a trip for fun.
Oh yeah, well it was something to do, and I also wanted to travel, and Czech Republic's kind of in the middle of everything. Yeah, and so it presented a lot more travel opportunities.
So you did that for how long?
Yeah, I was in the Czech for the first time for about 10 months. And it was quite enjoyable. Actually, I got a little traveled out because basically every weekend I would book a trip to somewhere. I took advantage of all the cheap airlines that exist in Europe, and I went to just all over the place. I went to Budapest. I went to Berlin. I went to Vienna. I went to Venice, Rome, Naples, Florence, Paris. Visited Krakow with you and your lovely wife.
Indeed, and we partied hard.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And a few other places, and Amsterdam, and I just kind of got I got a bit of my fill.
But at that point, you're still thinking like, I'm out here having fun, but eventually a time will come where I need to sort of figure out what I want to do with my career, and I'm probably going back to Canada.
Well, at that time, I just assumed I'd go back to Canada. It was kind of a temporary thing, kind of said I did it. There's a couple things that happened. One, I met my current wife when I was in the Czech, and she ended up coming to Canada for a bit, but she didn't want to really stay in Canada. I don't think she was quite prepared for the cold, and plus she wanted to get on with her kind of university career and everything, so she ended up going back. I stayed, and I wasn't sure whether I'd go back to Europe or not, but I kind of got, I don't know, just a little bit, I don't know how to put it, but living in Toronto at that time, it seemed a little it's kind of hard to put it, a little, I don't know, like everything was kind of laid out in front of me, like everybody I knew, essentially, they met their wife. They moved to some suburb of Toronto, like Milton or Barrie or whatever. They had 2 kids. They have, the house, the 2 cars. They had 3 weeks of holidays, and 1 week was spent in pick a place: Cuba, Mexico, Dominican Republic. 1 week was used at Christmas, and the other week was used in the summer to do something like paint the house. And, it just seemed like this path was right in front of me. And in Europe, I experienced something that was like quite different. So like in the Czech Republic, I had 8 weeks of holidays, partially because I was a teacher, but I knew lots of people who had 5 weeks of holidays. So just that kind of aspect of being able to travel more was quite appealing. At my work in Toronto, I asked them if I could take a pay cut to get an extra week of holiday, and they told me that if I worked there for 12 years, they'd consider it. Consider basically allowing me to make less money to get more holidays, which I thought was just kind of crazy considering, in Europe, it's just, in the UK, 5 weeks is standard. In Germany, 6 weeks is standard. So it just seemed kind of crazy to me. The other thing was just in terms of travel, like in Canada, it's much more expensive to travel around. It's one, just because of the distances, but two, I remember looking at a flight to New York and back, and Porter Air was by far the cheapest, but it was still going to be hundreds of dollars. Like in the Czech Republic, I was getting return trip flights for under $100 to places. So it just also that there was that aspect of it. And in terms of work-wise too, like a lot of the companies, it just seemed like Canada ended up being almost like a satellite of some bigger office that was in the States or somewhere else. And that a lot of the opportunities there were either for kind of national companies where, something big was going, it's like, oh, we're doing work in Alberta or something like this. Or it was, we're part of a big company, but it's the American division. So, you can travel around, but you're most likely going to travel in the United States, which didn't really appeal to me. So there's just a bunch of things. And also, I don't know, it's quite appealing. Like there's so many things about Europe as well. Like it's just different cultures. There's a lot more history. In the city that I was working in, the Czech Republic, I passed like essentially what I thought was just some kind of like big rock or something, or an old part of a building. And it turned out to be a piece of a fort. This is near the center of the town too, a piece of a fort that existed before Canada, or it was demolished before Canada was even a country. This is just something just kind of laying around. There's just the amount of history there is just kind of ridiculous.
There was nothing. There was nothing at all that was making you think twice.
Oh yeah, well, there is a lot of hard things about it. So like your support network, which is something that didn't really occur to me at first, but when you move to another country, wherever it is, you kind of lose your network. Like, in Canada, I have friends and family and everything, so it's a lot easier to kind of get things done. If you're looking for a job, you can hit up friends. When I came over to Europe, I knew nobody who knew anybody else who knew about jobs or anything like this. So it was kind of, I'm on my own in that respect. If you like even just something like having a pet, because we don't really know too many people here who, like in Germany, who we could just be like, okay, you look after our pet for the next 2 weeks while we're away. And it's a bit of an imposition.
I think I'll just mention that for those not familiar with the rest of your path, you sort of went from the Czech Republic to working in the UK, and now you're working in Germany.
Yeah. And all those places are kind of different. But, so and it really depends too, because on the type of person you are. Like I've met people who said they could never work in or live in a country where they didn't speak the main language. Well, it makes it a lot more difficult. That's for sure. It helps to speak English, which is fairly ubiquitous, but it's definitely by all means, like not everybody in Germany speaks English. It's, I've heard jokes like, people are saying, why would you ever learn German? Everyone speaks English, and it's just not the case. There's lots of people here who don't speak virtually any English. And in the Czech Republic, it's even worse. But, you kind of get by. But I think food usually ends up being something really big for people. Because the foods can be quite different. I know when I first moved to the Czech Republic, I hunted around for peanut butter forever. I was quite surprised to find that in a lot of cases, not only did people not like have it in their stores, but the employees had no idea what it was. I had a big discussion about even how to translate peanut butter into Czech properly, to ask for people where it is. It's all changing now. But in the first days when I actually found some, it seemed to be a seasonal item, and I paid an outrageous price to get it. It just was ridiculous. So I ended up having to kind of give up peanut butter until I got to the UK, where it's there and it's much cheaper. But you can't. The jars are still tiny and everything. And then there's other
real
things.
issues, folks. These are real problems.
I tell you. But it's one of these things, though, because like food, it's something anybody who ends up living in a different country ends up speaking about, because it is such a comfort. It's something that in Canada, everyone has some kind of story about Thanksgiving dinner or something like this, or Christmas ham or turkey or whatever. And when you go to a place and they don't have that, you start missing out. Some people are much better at adapting and kind of just get over it quickly. And then you see other people who just spend outrageous amounts of money trying to duplicate the life that they had before. So that, as that kind of zone of comfort, it's one of these kind of bizarre things.
Interesting, because you can do that with certain things more effectively, like media, for example, but harder to do still with food, right?
Yeah. Well, the internet's, I think, completely changed things too, because my wife, we pay something like $5 a month so that she can get Czech television, so she can stream it on the computer. I know a Bulgarian guy who does something similar. And when I first went over in 2007 to the Czech Republic, even things like Skype, you couldn't. There were certain kind of restrictions around calling certain numbers, and if you called certain numbers in Canada, it was actually quite expensive, it just ended up being this big issue. Whereas now, I can call Canada. I think when I call over VoIP, it costs me a half cent a minute. So effectively, I can just talk endlessly. But in the beginning, you end up having to hunt around for calling cards and all these other things just so you can talk to people. In the very beginning, I didn't have any internet set up. Calling Canada was extremely expensive, like from my mobile phone, because nobody in the Czech has landlines. So they're just not around. Even in the UK, it's still much more common that you have mobile phones, especially if you happen to live in an older flat. And so it was also quite isolating in the beginning, especially if you don't speak the language. So it's, but again, I've met other people from Canada who they are just incredibly social. And then within a matter of a couple of weeks, they have a new network of friends. That network of friends has helped them get a job. They've also helped them with like visa problems or any of this kind of stuff. And they just seem to do really well. And then you meet other people like, some of the people I was talking about who said, well, I would never even leave my country. It's just hugely dependent on the person, I think.
Well, and for you, did you ever have second thoughts?
Yeah, every now and then. Like my sister has, I have a niece and a nephew now that I didn't have when I first came out here. And so it's a little sad sometimes, seeing how quickly they grow when I go back to Canada. But it's always pros and cons. Like my wife has her family over here, so if we went to Canada, she'd be like away from them as well. I think that's probably the biggest one, is kind of like family, actually. But it's kind of ironic because I end up talking to my parents much more when I'm here in Europe than I do when I was living in Canada. Again, I think it's just because of the distance. It's the only interaction you've got.
I can see that. I think that's probably at the top of the list for many people. And again, it's the comfort issue, right?
Yeah, it's kind of your network, what you're used to. It's hugely, it's like moving anywhere else like that's really different. It's your whole kind of comfort system is just dismantled, and you really see it in some people where I know I talked to our Russian friend Alexei about how he knows Russians who speak no English. They go to the Russian butcher, the Russian dentist, the Russian everything, and they buy all the Russian foods, from the Russian store. And it's almost like they've tried to move Russia into Canada. And I was talking to a woman here, and she said she knows Turkish people who are exactly the same. They don't speak any German. They're and they go to the Turkish restaurants. They buy from the Turkish store, and it's like they've moved the country with them. It's not a long-term kind of success strategy,
Right.
at least in my opinion.
And some of those groups can do that, but others, like you were a Canadian in a smaller Czech town, right? When you started out. So going outside, there's probably even less people speaking English than in a bigger city in Germany where you are now. So that's not even an option for you, right? To replicate those things in your life.
Oh yeah, well it's not really. Like I know one guy who he would stay, a Canadian living in the Czech, who would stay up to 3 a.m. regularly to watch NHL hockey games. Just as that little bit. But for me, it wasn't quite as much as a possibility. But you just basically have to adapt, and it's kind of interesting because you can get kind of sad that you have to give something up. But I'm always surprised when I find something that replaces it that's almost as good or if not better. In the Czech, I had to give up peanut butter, but then you end up finding something that you like as much or more. The Czechs do fried cheese, which actually now I love, and every time I'm there, I end up buying fried cheese, which is just kind of bizarre because I feel like if I never left Canada, I would just think it's the grossest, most bizarre thing to fry a block of cheese and then to eat it. But it is quite addictive.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What about the corporate world? So there's, you went out there and you got a job. You started your career basically. Was that a different world? Was that, if I think about it, I'm like, well, that's where you're probably speaking more English and stuff. Is that where you're feeling better then, especially starting out?
Yes and no. Every country I've worked in has been different. And it's kind of, I thought they might actually be quite similar. But when I started working in the Czech, I was working in a university and, it was just a bizarre, because basically it was nothing like I've experienced. And, in the kind of the work world, the first day I was there, they gave me a shot of Slivovice, which is plum brandy. And it's pretty much just fire in liquid form. And this is 10 a.m. On my first day. And so, I was just like, okay, we're drinking first thing in the morning. This is not something that you would expect in Canada. Or I've heard from some people, if you drink a lunch beer, that's, suspicious and naughty. Mm-hmm. And then one day I was walking down the hall and I looked into a guy's office, and on his screen was a man basically blowing into a woman's breasts, like on his screen. He's just pretty much watching porn. And I was just kind of like, what?
I believe the technical term may be motorboating.
Thank you. I was unaware of that. And I spoke to another woman, and a few minutes later, I was like, You'll never guess what I just saw. And I described it to her, and she's like, oh yeah, he does that sometimes. And it's just like,
but just to be clear, this is a university, right? We're talking about, a slightly more liberal working environment.
Oh, this is true, but
nevertheless,
I
don't know how drinking at 10 a.m. would probably be frowned upon in North America.
Well, I know people who frown upon lunch beers because that's during working hours. So it was quite a different experience. And after that, I went back to Canada. I started working in an office. I thought it was pretty multicultural as well because there was people from 3 or 4 different kind of countries who were born in Canada, and even then there was various Canadians with different backgrounds. and different heritages. And then after that, I went to work in the UK, and it just kind of blew me away in comparison, because like there's 20, 25 people in the department, and almost none of them were born in the UK. They had been all over the place. Like one guy was his family was British, but they were in Brazil, and he was brought up in Brazil, and then he was schooled in the UK. And, he kind of went back and forth, and most of his family was in Brazil, and he was living in the UK. Another guy who was born in Belgium went to Australia and I think he was Australian, but he kind of considered himself Belgian. And then he went to the UK, and he spent a lot of time there. Lots of Australians, lots of Kiwis, and there's just tons of different backgrounds. And then coming to Germany, the department I worked in was even more diverse because it's such an international company. There's people from Vietnam, there's Russia, Ukraine, there's Germans, there's Romanians. It's just all over the place. There's people from France.
Are you saying that you were surprised to find it even more multicultural than?
Oh, well, I always have this impression of Canada being like one of the most multicultural places in the world, and I thought that would just translate as well into the workplace. But as I kind of went around, it just seems like it's just so much more multicultural in Europe, especially in these kind of bigger and more international companies, because you don't really. It's just for a company to grow. Like the biggest country in the EU is Germany, which I think is 83 or 84 million, and and to grow, they really have to start expanding into other countries. And then that expansion also presents tons of opportunities. Like the company I'm working in, there's a German guy who was actually doing similar work before me. He's now in China, of all places, running some of their analytics for them. And there's just tons of these opportunities. Like, at the company I was in the UK, they were asking me if I'd be interested in opportunities in Portugal or Sweden. There was also some opportunities in Australia and the United Arab Emirates, like Dubai. And it's just all over the place. It's just kind of crazy. Like, I don't know of the people I know in Canada, the ones really I've kind of followed and kept track of, most of them, like if you go international, you end up working in the States somewhere. I can't really think of too many people who started out in Canada and then have ended up in another country that's not the US. But yeah, so there's just more of these opportunities as well.
Right, and for the record, you work in a corporate environment in data. I don't know how much you want to sort of flesh that out, but it helps to give context in terms of what you're dealing with with regards to corporate culture.
Oh, well, the area I'm in is actually, it's in a multinational retailer. So if you think Costco, but Europe and Asia, that's pretty much the company I'm working for. I'm working in their corporate level, so that spans across countries. They're in 26 countries, I believe, and across Europe and Asia. And so that's the reason that there's just so much diversity there. It ends up creating some bizarre scenarios where they have stores in both the Ukraine and Russia. Some of the stores that were once in the Ukraine are now officially in Russia. And it's just it creates these bizarre scenarios where all these people have to work together, even though, I'm sure that the Ukrainians aren't necessarily
too happy about the situation. Yeah.
But everybody ends up being a complete professional about it. But it gives you a lot of things. It's something that I wouldn't really ever expect to have to deal with in Canada.
So what about an apples to apples comparison? You worked in a corporate environment, office environment here in Toronto, and then you've been working in that kind of environment in the UK and now in Germany. How are they different?
I found that, like, people-wise, in Canada, it seems like everyone's really friendly, but eventually you hit a bit of a wall, and it can get really difficult to get past that wall, to get really on a personal level. In the UK, I found that people will they're a little more guarded, but they eventually, if you get people drinking, they can open up quite a bit to you. It always seems to be that there's a much more kind of, especially in Europe in general, there's a much more kind of aspect of like a drinking culture, if you will. The UK call it, the pub culture, but just going out for a pint and having a drink and everything. In Germany, it seems to be the kind of the formality. There's a fair amount of formalness, but once you get past it again, it's kind of like, I think it's a little closer to Czech, because with the Czech I found that people are very formal in the beginning, but once they know you even reasonably well, just fairly well, they start telling you things about like their bizarre medical problems or something like this, and you just kind of end up getting a little surprised by it. Germany's somewhere in between that and the UK, so it's kind of interesting like that. I thought Germany though would be everyone's like incredibly efficient, but kind of closed or guarded, and just kind of, not rude, but just right to the point and everything. And it hasn't been that way at all. Like I've actually found just about everybody in Germany, not just in the office, but everywhere, just incredibly friendly. But unfortunately, I've found that some of the things, like it took me 2.5 months to get internet. I thought that when I walk into an internet store in Germany, that they pretty much know before I even walked in exactly what I wanted, where I lived, and that the internet will be there by the time you get home or something. It just has not been the case. Yeah.
That's interesting. Going back to what you were saying about the corporate culture, it's interesting that you had that impression here in Canada, that people are sort of more friendly at first, but then you only get so far. Did you find that even did you get enough opportunities to see people outside of the workplace and in those sort of social, let's say, drinking situations?
Yeah, it really depends, because at the office I had, there's 2 guys who pretty much hung out constantly. I think even their girlfriends ended up becoming quite good friends. So it definitely happens. But I think that people, my impression anyway in Canada, were that they were always a little concerned about, political correctness, whether they were crossing a line, or whether, you actually were felt about them the same way about that they feel about you. And so we're always kind of more guarded, I think. That's the impression I got when it came to past being friendly. In the Czech, I don't think people were that concerned about offending people. And you definitely get the impression that political correctness isn't quite as big a deal as it is in Canada.
Do you think that's changed you as a person? I know you were born here, so you're a product of that more cautious political correctness. I've always known you to be very polite and aware of sensitivities. Has that changed the way you behave and talk to people and opine?
I would say not. I always just kind of, I think it's one thing that hasn't really left me is that I'm always I'm guarded with some of these opinions and everything, and I tend to listen to other people's opinions a lot more than give my own. I think it's partially because everywhere I've been isn't my kind of home culture. So when people talk about issues or anything, I don't fully understand the entire background, and I kind of try and recognize that I don't fully understand. But eventually, I generally do. It depends on the issue. When it came to like things like Greek debt, I certainly gave my opinion because I've studied a little more economics and things, and I just thought some people are giving crazy opinions. But when it comes to other things like refugees and the refugee situation or kind of internal politics in various countries, I more or less just try and listen. Yeah.
Is that so? About that, I mean, we're sitting here. It's the 19th of November, 2015. Lots going on right now geopolitically, about with regards to the refugee crisis, with regards to international terrorism. extremists in the Middle East and elsewhere. How are you finding people on that? Are there people vocal with their opinions? I mean, probably in the corporate setting, I mean, those things don't factor in as much, but in general, in Germany especially, I think that would be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, it's interesting because the people who have kind of made an opinion have pretty much been complaining that they can't give an opinion. So given Germany's history, they've said even if you talk about trying to reform the system, if in any way or shape or form it can be interpreted as refugees get out, they feel that people quickly jump on the kind of the you're a Nazi bandwagon. So one case, one guy was saying basically that they wanted to reform the situation so that rather than giving refugees money directly, because there were refugees who are basically living, in terrible conditions, but keeping all the money that the German government was giving them, and then basically taking that money after they, after a few months and then leaving, this person was speculating that what they should do is give people vouchers, and those vouchers could be used to pay for things like rent or food or whatever, and pretty much that would kind of avoid this problem. But this opinion wasn't really allowed to be voiced in the media because that was like something a Nazi would want to do, like, oh, you're trying to deprive the refugees of something, and da 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 da. And so the person at work who I was talking to was kind of complaining that, well, maybe this is a good idea, maybe it's not, but it should be something that it's okay to talk about.
That's really interesting because it's sort of its own form of political correctness and sensitivities, right? Like we just talked about that culture being sort of more open and people being more free with their opinions, but then here we go, right? There are restrictions.
Well, I think there's basically a list. At least I think the one thing that's kind of struck me about Europe is it really seems to be kind of bound to its history. So sometimes it's really something that it's something that like gives people like a lot of pride. I live about 30 minutes away from where the Neanderthals were discovered. I live about an hour and a half away from where King Charlemagne ruled like half of Europe. And there's just a lot of history and everything to be proud of. But then on the other hand, I think a lot of people kind of get caught up in this. Oh, World War II was this, or even kind of smaller things like 500 years ago, your village did this to my village, and there's been this kind of senseless grudge ever since. Somebody was telling me, I met a guy from Frankfurt, and I was kind of talking about this a bit, and he's like, oh, I know exactly what you mean, because there's this city about 20 kilometers south of Frankfurt, and they're all idiots, or like that's what the people's opinions are.
Shelbyville.
Well, it's essentially the same type of thing, and and it just seems like Europe's trying to divide itself into smaller and smaller pieces. Scotland wants to separate, the Catalonians want to separate, the Flemish want to separate, UK itself wants to separate from Europe. It's just kind of ridiculous. It's again, I think this history and this kind of nationalism kind of binding it up, or kind of causing divisions.
I just had a thought. I mean, it seems to me like a lot of these issues, and from everything you just talked about to terrorism and a whole bunch of other things, is people really wanting to find meaning and being attracted to things that are bigger than them. That's the great thing about history, right? Yeah, and nationality and religion, and it's belonging, and it's about something bigger than you, and giving purpose to your life, right? That all of a sudden that guy going to work from 9 to 5 now has a purpose to go out and to wave a flag and protest, say about secession or something like that, and that's inspiring. That's purposeful.
Yeah, there's a great saying, I can't remember, but it goes something to the effect of nationalism is a source of pride for people who have nothing to be proud of. And to a certain extent, I think it's true, because a lot of people just kind of assume that it has something to do with education when they hear about terrorism. And I've read that many of the recruits for for a lot of like ISIS and even in other terrorist campaigns actually have university educations. In Egypt, I think it's the 9/11 bombers, something like half of them had university educations out of Egypt. So it's not just these are dumb people being misled. It definitely, to a large extent, I think it's about having a sense of purpose for a lot of people, especially the people who actually go to Syria. And then I've also read that Syria is actually paying decent wages to its fighters. Or sorry, not Syria, ISIS. They're actually paying decent wages for some people. It's just a kind of a way of making a living. It's kind of interesting also if you look at the adoption of communism. In a lot of cases, or at least in the case of, I believe, Russia and the Czech Republic, communism starts off as this fringe thing. And then as you start seeing it kind of taking hold, a lot of people actually start adopting it when they start realizing that this is a path to prosperity. So I wouldn't kind of discount that as well, this whether you're talking about terrorism, which, again, people getting paid decent wages and the spoils of war, or whether it's something like separatism, where somebody says, hey, I'm a little fish. If I break apart, maybe I can be a bigger fish in a littler pond. So I wouldn't discount that as well.
And bring it back to this context of, say, the expatriate and comparing, especially in your experience, Europe to North America. A common criticism of the West by a lot of Europeans is that, the West is soulless. The West, and you and I sort of touched on some of these things, but I'm wondering about your opinion on the whole sort of attitude. The West is soulless. People in the West just toil and toil and toil. They don't, they get barely any vacation. It's just about, working and, sort of, there is no culture. It's, shiny, glittery things, but there's not much substance. Thoughts?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think it's the debate between public and private spaces. So it's something I've heard come up a few times, and it's something that's to me is one of the kind of the stark differences. Especially like if you look at Germany, they will spend a lot of money on just things like festivals and all this kind of stuff. Like when I lived in Barrie, which is not a small city, but they had, it's just, they wouldn't, how to put it, it's, there was something going on, but it was just, basically there's one event going on, and maybe it's big or whatever, but it's not like the city I'm in now, which is Dusseldorf, where, each neighborhood might have its own kind of city or like neighborhood Christmas tree, and they might all have different festivals, which is kind of restricted to their neighborhood. It's just crazy. Dusseldorf always seems to have something going on, whether it's apparently the world's largest kind of motorhome exhibition, which I was kind of surprised.
Dusseldorf, out of all places, that's interesting.
Apparently, there's also had apparently the largest. This is what I've been told: the largest gathering of French people outside of France at a big kind of Yay France event. This is before the attacks, by the way. And there's just always seems to be something going on. Like there's several like Christmas fairs, and it's just kind of crazy. Whereas at least my experience in Canada is you'll have maybe like one big thing, like the or what's the Chinese Paper Lantern Festival or something like this, or the Ukrainian festival, but you don't have like tons of these things going on. And the theory I've heard is that in Canada you pay lower taxes, and you take that money and you invest it in things like having a giant screen TV, crazy sound system. You have a big house, and then you can invite your family over, but that's all private space stuff. In Europe, they have higher taxes, which go into the kind of the public coffers, and then pay for these kinds of bigger expositions and events and everything. And rather than go to your house and then drink, some beers with friends, or, watch a movie on your big screen or do whatever, you would go down to a restaurant, in the public space, or like public drinking here isn't the giant taboo that it is there. You actually frequently see people walking around with open alcohol. And you even see people just in the middle of a park with a picnic with a bottle of like wine and, all the food and everything. In Canada, open beverage, it's like a ticket, you have to dump it, blah, blah, blah. Here, it's just not that big a deal. And I think there's a lot of that. It's the soul or the soullessness isn't that there isn't happening. It's just that's happening in private spaces. If you could peer in through all the windows and you see all the families gathering around, a big meal or whatever, I'm sure that in aggregate, that is just as much quote unquote soul as you get when you walk through, a big, some of the closed streets, like the pedestrian ways and everything in these European cities. It's all out in the public for everyone to view.
Well, I think that may be helped by the fact that people over there, the culture is a lot more homogenous, right? Those festivals and stuff, they are rooted in their history and the majority religion, for example, right? When you look at multicultural metropolises like Toronto and countries like Canada, yes, there is funding that goes into, say, the Chinese New Year Festival or the Ukrainian Festival, but it's only going to attract so many people, right? People of that heritage and then others that are sort of interested. But we have little that we all celebrate or that we sort of all care about, and so it becomes difficult to get people to rally around certain things, I think. One of the only things that has really survived, and it's been, for the most part because of the way it spurs capitalism, is Christmas or the holidays, as they are referred to.
I don't know if I'd agree with that, though, because like this part of Germany, there's something like 25% are foreigners. It's just a huge number. And, you have places in Canada like, satellite cities of Toronto that are effectively, I've been talking, the company I work for has an office in India, and the guy was joking that, half his family lives in Markham. And he says, I have tons of relatives who live in Montreal or Toronto and all that. I definitely think it's there. It's just like, if I think about Barrie, they used to, for only part of the year, they would shut down the main street, and they would, there would be patios, and then there'd be, like the bars could expand onto there and everything like this. And then there's lots of complaints about it. And then one year there was a fight with a bunch of people, and so they're never doing it again. Here there's just streets that are permanently closed to cars. And they're just pedestrian ways, and restaurants for most of the year they have like tables and chairs and everything all set up. You can order food, and if a fight happens, well, it's a fight that fight happens. We were out one time and we saw all these police standing around. And I guess some people, got into a fight, and the police responded by having 40 officers attend. It wasn't necessarily that 40 were needed, but they made it quite clear that, look, this is not going to escalate. And it's never the impression that I got in Canada. The impression I got in Canada is that we don't want all this kind of trouble.
Well, but we're also comparing Dusseldorf to Barrie, and there are many incongruities there. I mean, in terms of how cities in Europe came about, and, even before cars were a priority, and, size-wise, and again, makeup and lifestyle and stuff like that, right? So, I don't know.
Yeah, but Toronto was laid out, because Toronto's been around since the car really didn't gain prevalence to, the 40s? Yeah, Toronto.
That's true. Toronto is an interesting example, because there are other cities in North America that are much more pedestrian friendly. Funny enough, I was just hearing a story today about some groups wanting to sort of revitalize Yonge Street and give it more pedestrian space and stuff like that. I see what you're saying. Again, I think the Westerners in general, North Americans, really prioritize their personal space, their let me do my thing and you do your thing. Maybe that's a part of it.
Well, it's really interesting because if a lot of the especially like the younger people, or 20s, let's say, the people I met in the UK, for them, nobody really went over to a friend's house and drank. Like in Canada, I went to tons of house parties, but that's not really as big a thing here, especially if you're younger. If you're younger, you meet up at the pub, and also alcohol tends to be a lot cheaper here, because I remember trying to just go right out to the bar in Canada and drink, and it's just incredibly expensive. With alcohol being more affordable, a lot more people actually go just meet up at the pub, and that's where they drink, and they drink out with friends and everything. So I think also there's kind of like a lot of because the other thing is when people in Europe talk a lot about culture, depending on the group you're talking about, but I find a lot of them actually also mean culture and drinking. And for some people, it's inseparable. I don't know if you've ever heard of Guy Fawkes Night. So it was like, it was just a couple of weeks ago. So Guy Fawkes was he was the guy who tried to blow up Parliament. And every year they celebrate it by, I guess, his capture. I guess they're not celebrating him, although I never really clarified. Mm-hmm. But they celebrate by basically getting a large, building an effigy of him, setting him on fire, marching down the streets, letting off fireworks, and then lots of drinking and everything like this. And I'm like, well, you're not that far away from essentially a riot. You drunk people setting things on fire and and but this is just part of the culture. And I was talking to one guy about it, and I was like, is this a great thing? Because he's telling me stories about when he was a kid and how much he loved it. And I'm like, well, is this a great thing? For you to be 12 years old and to see all this stuff? And he's like, I never thought about it. But for them, it's just, it's just part of the culture.
Right, but that's been around, that happened in 1605, right? So it's had time to sort of build out as an event,
it's also had time to die, though, because I believe it was the Puritans who tried to eliminate just about every Christian celebration. Christmas is the only one they really weren't able to kill. Apparently, there used to be quite a few celebrations that happened. And then over, I can't remember the exact centuries, but somewhere in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, they managed to get almost all of them kind of killed.
Maybe it's that over there people have had to sort of hold on to culture. You're living on a continent that has so many different cultural groups in different countries, right? And those influences are all around you, right? Not to mention, in recent history, the influence of the U.S., right, in culture all over the world. So you're fighting to keep those things, and they become important. Whereas I think in North America, we fight for neutrality. I think we fight for fairness of every culture to be expressed, as opposed to, hey, this is our culture.
Oh, maybe. I find a lot of people when they talk about these events, usually they talk about the fun they have celebrating them. For a lot of people, I think it's not necessarily about the culture or whatever. It's a chance to get together with family and friends and do something fun. Because you don't hear much about festivals of suffering and exercise or something like this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those ones I don't think have managed to survive.
Mm-hmm. So not as fun.
The Toil in the Fields festival, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly different. I get the same vibe. I mean, I go to Europe and I come back here, but pros and cons, right?
Oh yeah. But it ends up being I have to admit I don't take advantage of as much of this kind of stuff as perhaps I should, but there's just something. It always seems like there's some kind of festival or something going on, and Dusseldorf isn't exactly a huge city, especially not by European standards. And there's just always tons going on. It's just kind of crazy.
And at this point, would you want to be anywhere else?
Probably. I actually would. Well, I really like to move back to the Czech Republic because it was just the most kind of, I found, livable kind of place. It wasn't great for work though, especially not as a non-Czech speaking foreigner. But yeah, it was just a really nice kind of place to live.
Interesting. Are you at all learning the language?
I took some courses, but basically the plan is that eventually move back there and then just take some crash courses. It's one of the other things, the tax system, because the UK drives me crazy because the language courses are actually quite expensive. Especially regardless of what it is, Czech especially. Unlike Canada, you can't deduct them from your taxes. London is extremely expensive to begin with, and so to end up spending hundreds of dollars every month on extra lessons, it just wasn't something that we really could swing at the time. And especially when you consider that effectively you can go to the Czech Republic at the exact same lessons for a fraction of the price. It just seemed kind of crazy. Yeah, but it's something, because until you learn the local language, you're effectively a tourist, regardless of how long you've been there, if you're not fluent in it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it lets you understand people. I mean, not literally understand people so much better, but figuratively, and their culture and the way they think and their ways.
Oh, definitely. And even just doing basic things, being able to do them yourselves is just such a big step forward in your kind of integration. Because otherwise, you're always on the kind of the fringe.
Well, Murray, we are always going to welcome you back.
Oh, thank you.
Prodigal son that you are. Eating your fattened calf and at your booze parties and festivals. You come crawling back, we'll welcome you back.
Oh, thank you very much, Adam. It's very kind of you.
Oh, thanks a lot for this. I think it's great to talk to somebody like you to get an understanding of that. So many people think about it. It's not as easy for Canadians or Americans to take a chance like that and try that out. It's because if you're a Czech or if you're a Pole or a German or a Briton, you can do that more easily, right? Oh, I'll go take a job in Paris, and I'm from Berlin, and so if anything, I can come back once a month or twice a month. But to do that from Canada is not as easy. So I think it's interesting for people to hear what that's like.
Well, I think it's one of the reasons why so many Canadians go to the U.S. It's just so much easier. Both in terms of kind of logistics of getting home and to whatever city, but also in terms of visas. Because I know a friend, his brother and wife, who were they're Canadian. They were in the UK. They were living there for 4 years, and the UK government denied them a renewal of their visa, and they had to go back to Canada. So I couldn't even imagine having to just drop everything, and then just have to move your whole life. They wanted to stay, and they actually said that they're going to go back to Canada and then reapply. There are lots of these kinds of little loopholes all over the place to be able to do it. But if you don't fit into one of them, it's very difficult.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot. This was really great.
Oh, no, thank you for having me.
Come back anytime.
Thanks.